This week, here I am in Adrigold, which is right on the outskirts of County Kerry. In fact, we're in County Cork, but we're still in the diocese of Kerry. And I must say, this morning I travelled a long distance to get to here, but when I reached Adrigold, then I travelled through what was a beautiful scenic road until I reached the bay, which is right down here in front of me. And we have a marvellous view out the window here. And what brought me here was a man who I think is going to tell me some wonderful history, stories, and many, many other things about this locality. And Sean Nicholson?
Nicholson.
Yeah. Now, Sean, that isn't really an Irish name. Can you tell me where you all about yourself?
Well, back in the 1800s, probably around 1810, the miners at Allihies mines, a third of the workforce, which was 1,200 people, a third came to Allihies. Their chief business in Allihies, of course, was to show the natives how to work the copper mines. The people of Allihies, of course, had no experience whatsoever of mining, and when the Cornish people came over, they were not very welcome at first, because the people felt that they were taking away some of their jobs, which of course they were, but if they didn't come, the mining couldn't take place. And my great-grandfather was James Nicholson. He was amongst the people who came to the mines. Of course, all the people that came weren't actually miners. In other words, they weren't working under the ground. There was lots of different trades there. There was, for instance, there was sawyers, which were people who sawed the wood for the props in the mines. And that was a full-time job. There was others which was involved in the steam engine, which was most important, because if the steam engines couldn't keep going, well, the mines would shut down. And I think, as far as we know, my great-grandfather was involved in the steam engines. He probably was a mechanic or something in that line.
Yeah, and you know, when I was travelling in here, Sean, I saw we came through a famine village, and can you tell me, have you any memories of the little village up the road?
Well, I suppose there was, in Roos today, there's probably only about 20 people living there altogether. But I suppose at that time there was over 200 people, it seems, living there. They had their own school. And some time ago I was told that there was a man lived there who he used to make coffins. And the first coffin he made, of course, it was a sight to be seen by all the young people moreover. They never saw a coffin. And he had his own bench, which was made of a flat rock. It still can be seen, but part of it has worn away now. And he had his own, I suppose, all his tools there. And I suppose you could say there was a shop there as well.
I heard this was owned by the Yank, would that be right?
It probably was, I suppose, yeah. And he had a small shop, and he was an old man of the area. About 50 years ago, he would be over 80 when he died. He remembers buying apples in the shop at a penny a piece. It wasn't that he wanted to buy the apple, but he wanted to be able to say afterwards that he bought an apple in this particular shop. And this woman at the shop, she used to go to Bantry, which is just southeast from where we are today, at the shores of Bantry Bay. And one time she brought home her groceries, and there's a course here, which is a cave, and they used to land at the bottom of the cave. And as she was getting out of the boat with her belongings, she stumbled and she fell into the cave further up as she was going to the top. And all her belongings fell into the water, but the men on the boat were able to salvage the messages, and there was no trace of the shopkeeper or the woman of the shop.
Yeah.
And it seems that she was caught in a holly bush. Her skirt got caught in a holly bush in the middle of the coast, and she was saved. Otherwise, she'd have been swept out to sea.
Did the people live off fishing around here?
Yes, mostly off of fishing. I suppose you could say 90% of their income was from fish, and their food as well.
Yeah. And what do you know what they fished for down in this part of the bay?
I suppose a lot of the time it was for hake. They would fish out in the middle of Bantry Bay. There's probably no hake now in Bantry Bay because all the fishing boats have fished the place dry. I suppose the hake are cut miles out to sea now. But then all the people of this parish, it was one of their main source of income was fishing the hake and selling the hake.
Yeah. And can you tell me, is there something about why did they abandon the village? Why is it empty now, and why are all these people gone?
Well, I suppose the famine had a terrible effect on the place. Most of the people died out, and those that didn't die out immigrated, and all these houses that you saw today, these ruins, there's no relations of these people to be got at the present time. They probably went some before the famine and more afterwards, and that's why that their little homes were closed down and they fell in. And the school, of course, there was no children, of course, didn't go to school, so that's what happened. There's another little story now I'll tell you which happened, of course, maybe 60, 70 years ago. At that time, people from this parish, especially from the eastern side of the parish, they would go to Bantry probably once a month, but mainly at Christmas time to buy the goods for the home and so on. But they also brought, we'll say, usually pigs to be sold at Bantry Fair. And I suppose this particular man brought a pig to Bantry to be sold. The pig would be a fat pig, he'd be called a cache. That would be the Irish word for a fat pig. He wouldn't be a sow or a bonner, but he'd be what you call in between. So when they went to Bantry, he sold his pig and everybody was happy and they all returned after a few hours. And on the way from Bantry they passed Hoodie Island. To the western end of Hoodie Island there are long rocks protruding up the bay. They are known as the Gearons. And all of a sudden the man who sold the pig shouted out loud, "The coilis ma arigid." I lashed my money. Of course, the money was the money that he got for the pig. It was a very serious matter to have lost the money because they were the whole year fattening the pig, and the money would be wanted at home by his wife, and he almost threatened to jump into the sea rather than face home without the money. So after a bit of a consultation, they decided they'd return to Bantry. And they returned to Bantry and they went up the steps of the pier and they walked around the pier. And again he shouted, "The forest Marrigan, I found my money." And of course they again threatened to throw him into the water because he put him to the mounted table, and the day was getting dark, the evening, and they wanted to be across the bay before nightfall. So he was questioned as to where did he find it and what was after happening. So he told them that when he stood up on the pier, he felt something hard underneath his foot. And he took off his shoe and stocking, and there was his money. It seems that he had a hole in his pocket, which is an Irishman's case, and the money moved down along his leg and into the boot. So they returned to Bantry, to Adrigo rather, and they were all happy, of course, that the man had found his money. And it was issued a warning that to have it ever again happen. And the funny side of the story is, after that, we'll say that his name was John Sullivan. This is a fictitious name, of course.
Well, there are plenty of O'Sullivans down
right.
here.
So we wouldn't be slow in hiding the name that way. So he was known afterwards as Arigid and Acacia. The money of the fat pig that he sold, you see, Arigid and Acacia would be the Irish for that. So after that, his name was Arigid and Acacia. So somebody said afterwards when he died, when he was prayed for in the local church, everybody was asking who was John Sullivan. Of course, he wasn't prayed for as Arigid and Acacia, but everybody whispered around, "Arigid and Acacia is dead." That's the story.
Oh, I think that was well put and well said, you know. But I suppose if you go back before the age of television and radio and that, I mean, people did sit around the fire and they told stories. I mean, this is how they passed the time, really, wasn't it?
Well, they told stories, but more importantly, they were able to trace relations back to 600, or 7 generations, and they were able to. Matchmaking, of course, was the main topic, and some people felt to see that if we were marrying, we'll say a neighbour, maybe somebody on the other side of the parish, there was the fortune came up, you see, and sometimes it was accepted and more times it was not. And if there was any weakness in any side of the family, it would be brought up so that to reduce the fortune. Mm-hmm. But those things are gone now, they're past and gone. But they still live on in the memory of the people. And it's good in a way that we can think about past, and even though I suppose it's good fun at times, but it was all true. What they told us, it was all true. Yeah.
And I think the older people as well had a kind of a greater sense of knowing where they came from. They knew their parents, their grandparents, their great grandparents.
Oh, they did indeed. They were very much involved in that, and even today, that tradition has been handed down to the people who live here. And as we all know, the people who come from America especially, looking for their roots, looking for who their great-grandfather was and great-grandmother. And they can always be told, even Sullivan's, it is rather complicated, but still, if they had any nickname at all as regards the name Sullivan, it wouldn't be very long till the whole thing would be put together.
Yes, yes. The O'Sullivans, of course, the O'Sullivans of Beara is a story that I did another program on, and I couldn't believe that there were so many O'Sullivans on the Beara Peninsula. But of course, I suppose generation after generation, they stayed on and got married, and I think your mother was an O'Sullivan too, is that right?
Oh, no, actually my mother was Abbott, but my grandmother, her mother and my father's mother were Sullivan, and my grandfather's mother was Sullivan. So
there would be a Sullivan everywhere.
No matter what surname we have, we can't get away from the Sullivans, or the O'Sullivans.
Yes, yes.
And then there were different septs of the O'Sullivans, of course. There was a sept over in Two Assist. They were known as the McFeeny and Doves. They were a sept of the O'Sullivans. They were landlords. And there was a man lived in Adrigal one time. He was he was born in the 1700s. He was Peter McSweeney. He was a smuggler, and he had a lot of property from Richard White, who was the Earl of Bantry. And Richard White was actually his godfather. He'd be the godfather to the second Peter McSweeney. And at the same time, they had some relation to the McFeeny and Doves. And generally speaking, that time, a lot of these landlords, and they married cousins or distant relatives so that they keep the name, shall we say, going. And it also enabled them to have rights to property. If you married your cousin and had a right, you had a second right by marrying a cousin. And this Peter McSweeney, he went from Adrigal to Two Assist in about 1815, because the last member of the McFeeny and Doves, who was known as Sylvester O'Sullivan, he died when he visited his sister up in a place called Rathcahill in County Limerick. And it seems that he was leaving the house after helping his sister with her affairs, as her husband had died some short time before that. Mm-hmm. And he fell off his horse and he was killed. Some of his enemies were involved in it, but whether they were or not, he was killed, and he was brought back to parish to assist, and he was buried in Keane MacLogue Cemetery, where 7 generations of his ancestors were buried before him. And of course, there was a lot of contestants in for the property and for Doreen House, for the place he lived in. And Mrs. Brown, who was his sister, she sent to Adrigal for her cousin Peter McSweeney to help her with her affairs, and she also made him her agent. And when he went over, he, of course, being a relation, he brought his son with him, young Peter McSweeney, and after some time, young Peter McSweeney married Mrs. Brown's daughter, which was cementing the cousin business again. And she was an only daughter, and of course that gave them more rights to the property. But of course on the other side there was plenty of the O'Sullivans who claimed that they were just as near, and of course there was an amount of fighting, physical or otherwise, for Doreen House. And one day, when after Peter McSweeney, and this is young Peter McSweeney marrying Lucy Brown, he arranged for about 80 men, and he armed each one of them, and he marched with him into the Doreen House and took it over. And of course, he being a friend of Lord Bantry, he had no jurisdiction over that part of the Beara Peninsula, which is in County Kerry, but the landlord in Tinmare was Lord Lansdowne. And I suppose he got a whisper probably from the Lord Bantrys, and he approved of his taking over of Doreen House. And so once he was inside, then it was made official, and he lived there for over 40 years afterwards. But after that, then one day it seems that his son, which would be the third Peter, he married a young girl who was a relative of the enemy O'Sullivans, and of course he was penalised for doing that, and he was ordered out of Doreen House with his young wife, and he was told never again to come back.
Right.
Another day after that, then it seems Larrock Church was the church very near to Doreen House, and that was the place where the McSweeneys and the O'Sullivans went to Mass. They were all Catholics, of course. And he refused to go to Mass in Larrock after evicting his son because he was afraid of a confrontation at Mass, or probably after Mass, because there was plenty of enemies waiting for him. So he decided to go westward, as they say, on the Beara Peninsula, and he went to the first village, which is Agroom, which is in County Cork, but very near where Doreen House is. And it seems that he was going down by boat, down the Kinmare Bay, and it seems that he got a few shots fired from the land by the O'Sullivans very often. They were trying to kill him, and they struck his boat on one occasion, but he survived. And where do we go now?
Sean, I think you're great to have retained so much of the story of the Doreen.
Well, that's right.
Yeah.
But another thing about it, then, one morning when he went to Mass in Agroom, when he came home, he found his belongings were out in the yard. And he was astounded, of course, and so was his family. And, of course, he was evicted there and then by Trinch, who was the landlord's agent in Kinmare at the time. And Trinch, the landlord before him was a man by the name of Hickson, and he was a great friend of McSweeney's. But Trinch didn't like McSweeney for some reason, and he evicted him. And McSweeney, of course, and his wife and some of his family, they went in out of Kerry and down to Bantry, where they lived in a house in a place called Ahakiste, and that's overlooking Dunmanus Bay, which is a lovely area of West Cork. And there he lived, but his wife died about 3 months afterwards. It seems she was broken-hearted, because after all she was the last of the survivors of the O'Sullivans, that's the McFeeny and Doves, where 7 generations of her family, as I said before, was buried in the Kinmacalog Cemetery. And of course she was also broken-hearted because she saw her son no more after he being evicted, and she was buried in Bantry. And he lived on for about 3 years longer. He lived in a place called Dromore Castle. He must have left the castle, and he died in Dromore Castle. And the strange thing about him was that he was buried in the churchyard in Bantry at 9:30 in the morning, which is rather unusual for anybody to be buried then or now. So that's a short story about the McSweeney and Doves and the McSweeneys who had connections here in Addergold.
And Sean, tell me, did the McSweeneys then take their in-laws to court after that?
Yes, that is quite correct. It has been said that Peter McSweeney was very fond of law. He was at his element in court. And out in Kinmare Bay there are 3 islands. They're known as the Sherky Islands. And it seems these are islands that when the Down survey took place, they were not included in the maps. In other words, they paid no dues to either church or state for these islands. And way back, centuries ago, they were owned by the McGillicuddies. The McGillicuddies is a very famous Kerry name. And Hart's Pedigrees, which was a book written by a man by the name of Hart, and he stated in dealing with the O'Sullivans that McGillicuddy was a Christian name of the O'Sullivans, and later it became a surname, and that's why McGillicuddy is McGillicuddy today. And it seems also that McGillicuddy's daughter married the McSweeney and Dove of the day, and the part of her dowry was these islands, the Sherky Islands. Therefore they were owned by the McSweeney and Doves at that stage, and of course it was part of the estate that McSweeney was about to contest, and he did contest. I suppose you could say he was a very greedy man, because he achieved getting into Derrien House for 40 years, but then he wasn't satisfied. He said he'd go to court with the O'Sullivans and seek the ownership of these islands. And it seems also that the O'Sullivans really had rights as well, but he ignored them, and the court decided that they awarded him the large island and they gave the 2 small islands to the O'Sullivans. Mm-hmm. And it seems that the O'Sullivans, I suppose, they wanted the money because they spent an amount of money in these law courts, and he held on to his own islands up to about 40 years ago. His descendants sold them about 40 years ago. Even after he died, they were still in his possession, but he still held them. So nobody knows where his money came from, how he was able to hold on to the islands after spending an amount of money. And another thing, of course, I didn't mention earlier, was when he, after being evicted, he contested in the law court again that he should be allowed compensation for losing Derrien House. And he was awarded by the landowner at the time, Lord Lansdowne. He awarded him £1,200. And of course, Tinch was the agent, and it raises the question, should Tinch have ever evicted him in the first place? Mm-hmm. He probably evicted him without his Lord Lansdowne knowing anything about it. So he wasn't a poor man by any means, even after £1,200 in the 1800s was an amount of money.
Was Derrien House burnt down then at one stage?
That would be very later still, I'd say, probably in the 20s, but today it is renowned as a beautiful place for shrubs and flowers.
It's beautiful gardens.
Yes, yeah, that's right. You have the rhododendrons in bloom in April and May, and some of them into June. You have the camellias and the azaleas and some of the exotic palms and some huge trees, of course. So visiting Derrien today, it is very peaceful and beautiful. But come back 140 years ago, it was a different story altogether.
Yes. Would you have any idea how the house looked in those days? Was it a fortress or? No,
it was not a fortress. No, it was a large house. It was not a fortress. The harbour comes up very near the house. It seems that he had oyster beds there as well, and it seems he was gaining about £100 a year out of the oyster beds alone, which was not a sum of money to be found in those days. So he had another thing about McSweeney. He was a great man with a gun. He used, they say, have a lot of his friends visiting, and he would take them out shooting around the Caha Mountains. and whatever amount of grouse or snipe was shot during the day, he'd leave all his sons or all his friends shooting, but in the evening himself would take over. And after an hour he had more of the grouse and snipe shot than they had done all day. So that'll tell you how accurate he was with the gun.
Of course, that was a great pastime in those days.
It was a great pastime. It was for all the gentry. The gentry is right. Yeah. There was another incident too, of course. When he was in Adrigole, he had he was again involved with a man by the name of McCarthy Merriger. McCarthy Merriger was Merriger comes from the word freckled. Merriger is freckled.
Freckled?
Yes, a freckled individual.
Yeah.
And that was the only good thing I think that's about him, but it seems he went into Beara, probably into our groom, and he was about to evict a family, large family, and father and mother, for not paying their tithes. The tithes were the money that was collected for the Protestants to keep up the upkeep of the Protestants, paid by the Catholics, and of course paid by the Protestants themselves as well.
Yeah.
And it seems that he went to the constable in Castledownbere, and he told him that he should arrest McCarthy Merriger because he was a dangerous man. And the constable, of course, there, naturally enough, was afraid of undertaking the arrest, so he said, "I'll go if you'll go with me." So McSweeney, of course, was delighted to go. There was no such thing as refusing.
He
was ready for action.
Action, yeah.
And they went to our groom, and they arrested McCarthy Merriger. And McCarthy Merriger was accompanied by his father. McCarthy Merriger was a native of Adrigole as well. And when he went to arrest him, he took his gun. This is the constable took his gun. And McSweeney observed that he had another gun in the other hand. And he shouted at him to hand up his arms. And he replied to McSweeney, "Not to you, you rascal," or probably words to that effect.
Yes, and that provoked him, of course.
And McSweeney, he pulled his gun, he said, "I'll have your life," and McSweeney pulled his gun and shot him dead.
My goodness.
It was a case of shooting and asking questions afterwards.
Yes.
And after that, an old man told me one time that he brought home the body of the McCarthy Merriger and brought it home to his mother, which would be on his route from that moment. And of course, he was on the run for murder. And he went down through the old roads to Adrigole and over into a place called Coal Mountain, which is in the northern side of the northern side of the Dunmanway parish. And there it seems that he stayed with a family of O'Learys, Peter and Paul O'Leary. They were friends of his, and they were people that used to visit him to assist and go out shooting with him, so on.
Yeah.
And he remained there for a good while. But while he was there, he went to Lord Bantry and told him what was happening. And of course, Lord Bantry was his godfather, and the case didn't come to the courts until 2 years afterwards. The shooting took place in 1812, and the courts came to court in 1814, 2 years afterwards. And of course, Lord Bantry was a witness in the court. And as the old proverb says, it's fair fuckles a court na punta sporan. A word in court is better than money in the purse. And he gave him a great reference. He told him that there was no better and no nicer man to be had. Of course, everybody didn't believe that, but nevertheless, the case was dismissed. He claimed, you see, that he shot in self-defence. So
My goodness, yeah.
So that is the story of the arresting the tight proctor, or shooting the tight proctor.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
And, kind of all around that area, it's steeped in history. You have Lord Lansdowne in Kenmare. He got on very well with his tenants. Well,
he did indeed, and so did Lord Bantry in this side of the peninsula here along the
Or were
Of
they
course
good
were.
friends? You used to.
I would say so, yes. They certainly knew one another, I'd say.
They'd meet at the top of the mountain.
I'd say so, yes. I'd say
Yeah.
so, yes. Well, of course, they would be meeting at probably the shooting parties and probably in the line of having dinners and so on. They would certainly be meeting.
And we're looking out here in front of us. In fact, I just saw a magnificent boat just going up along the bay. Across the way, what mountains are we looking at?
Across the bay, we call it Carberry here, but it is called Muintervara. That extends actually in the southern side of that place. There's what you call a Hakista, the place that I spoke earlier about, where McSweeney went after being evicted to assist. And of course, it's very rough, it's very hard to land on that side of the bay. There's no landing place at all actually until down the bay, a place called Goerhees.
Close to Bantry Bay.
Close to Bantry, yes, that's right. And there's mussel farms, of course, there now, and factory there in that part of the bay. But up along, going out to the very end, is the place is known as the end of that peninsula, the other side being Bananas Bay.
Mm-hmm.
The boat that we're looking at now is a boat that's after leaving a stone quarry, which is just about half a mile down the bay from where we are. This was opened some 13 years ago by Wimpy's, and they were assisted by a man by the name of Fleming. And a few years ago it had been sold again to a crowd called Tan McAdam. So it is Tan McAdam Fleming now rather than Wimpy Fleming. And there's a good lot of people working there, but some people don't like it, some of the people around, because in a very windy day the dust from this quarry, it would blow for miles around.
Would it really?
Yeah, it would indeed, yes. But otherwise, I suppose it's giving employment, and that's an important thing in itself.
Where we're situated here, we're right down beside the sea, really, and we're looking at a very rugged, rough landscape out the window. There must be memories of this place, Sean.
Well, there is one memory in particular that an old man told me about, I suppose 7 or 8 years ago. He is now dead. It seems it was a night of a big storm, and the storm didn't start until about 12 o'clock at night. It was around the month of October, and this particular farmer, he had pits of potatoes just very near the sea here, and it being dark, and there was no such thing as flash lamps in those days, only lanterns. And some of his neighbours came and they said, well, we better go down and do something about the pits of potatoes. So of course there couldn't be any hats and cats down there in the middle of the night. And they went down anyway, and they looked on, and the sea was raging. The water was coming in well in over the land and very close to the pits of potatoes. And before they left, the water was coming right over the pits of potatoes. And needless to say, a pit of potatoes to a farmer up to 100 years ago was very, very important indeed. It was food for the house for the year. And the man was really almost delirious when he saw what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And he took his rosary bead out of his pocket, and he walked up to the pit of potatoes, and he laid the rosary bead and the pit of potatoes. And he said, we leave it to God, and they all returned. And their houses was about a quarter of a mile away from where this happened. And in the morning, at the dawn of day, they came down to the scene of the storm, and all the land was all boulders and stones thrown all over the place, and the pit of potatoes was intact. It was never touched. That was told to me by a man who was a very young boy at the time it happened, and who was present on the morning when they inspected the pit of potatoes.
That's extraordinary, isn't it?
That is a true story.
And just that patch survived,
Yes,
and the rest of the place was a total wreck.
Total wreck is right, yes.
Yeah.
That is quite correct. So he was a man of great faith, of course, and his prayers were answered. And it was very important that they were, because he'd be in dire circumstances for the remainder of the year. And of course the neighbours would have helped him, but I suppose big families at the time, everybody that had pits of potatoes, they wanted it for themselves. So that's a story that you wouldn't hear happening today, but for that matter, there is no pits of potatoes today.
Yes, yes. You know, the farming around here wouldn't be great with the way the land is at the moment. I mean, it's all very rugged.
Very rugged, but it was the smart farmers, of course, they had their cows and their own milk, of course, and they made their own butter. But they also fished. Everybody, it seems, had a boat that lived along the shore. They all, you could say, they lived by the sea. And I suppose it was a healthy diet, fish, and their own milk, and their own butter, and their own vegetables. The people of that time, I think, were more industrious than the people of today. They realised that they had to work, or otherwise they wouldn't survive. And indeed they did survive. But I suppose we as their descendants don't look back on that at all now today. We take things for granted.
And everybody had their own craft. You know, they could produce, for example, you had the thatcher, you had the blacksmith, you had the, everybody had their own thing to do.
Yeah.
And money was exchanged, at least money wasn't exchanged, it was goods were exchanged for goods.
Goods were exchanged, is right. And that brings me to a little story down where we spoke about where the stone quarry is today. It was an entirely different situation that time. Of course, I remember it myself because I was working in the area when they came there to start this quarry. And an old man who was out in his 90s at the time told me just the year before that in this part of the bay, this place was called Cwrs y Canu, that's the cave of the merchant. And why it was called the cave of the merchant was, it seemed that there was turbary in the area as well. And looking out in Bantry Bay, we have Whiddy Island to the left and Bear Island up the bay to the right. And of course, island people, there are usually no turf bags in islands, and they bought their turf in the winter time from people here. And they used to take it out by boat, and hence the name Cwrs y Canu. And earlier still, you see, people were illiterate and they couldn't count.
Yeah.
And it seemed that the turf was bought in pence. It didn't go as far as the pound, it was bought in pence.
Yes.
And when they'd be sharing out the money, they'd do it like this: one for you, and one for me. And when the whole thing was shared out, they all had their equal amount of money. Maybe someone had a penny over and above. And sometimes it caused a bit of trouble, but that is the way they transacted their business.
They'd have awful problems today, wouldn't they?
That's right, they would indeed. They would indeed. But, that's why it was called Cwrs y Canu.
There must have been nice times too. At least I know there were hard times, but people really were in touch with nature.
They were indeed. And close to that too, there was, it seems, like the townland of Roos, all these townlands near the sea were fairly populated, maybe 9 or 10 times more so than they are today. And there was a fence to be built between two of the townlands, and all the neighbours on both sides of the townland, they agreed to come this morning to make the fence. But some few men from one of the townlands, I suppose, agreed again. He said he'd come the evening before and he'd put the fence 5 or 6 feet in his own side, and their side rather, giving himself more land.
Yeah. And
when they came in the morning, they noticed it, and the coats were thrown off and the sticks were used, and it has been said that there was people killed in the area. There was because of the making of the fence. And it seems that a part of the fence is still visible today, where it was built the evening before, and there was no fence built afterwards, of course, because there was so many people killed there. And after that, it seemed that there was if you walked along that path at night in the evening, you would see a lady sitting in a rock combing her hair, and a little child standing at her knee. And she was seen there on several occasions. So whether she had anything to do with the people who were killed, or whether she was a relative or not,
all because of this wall.
It was after that she was seen there, and she was seen there up to probably 50 years ago. So I suppose another entrance to this quarry is a place called, it wasn't a road actually, it was a path. It was Connachan Muke was the name, with a little rock near it. And people thought that it was a place for bringing pigs down to the path. But it seems that a black pig used to be seen there at midnight, and 5 or 6 bonhams crossing the road with her. And they used to be always seen going from south to north. You would never see them coming back.
And why was that?
Well, I don't know, it must be something from the other world. Probably the black pig was taking the shape of a human person. But it was around this area where this massacre, if you like, a miniature massacre took place.
Yeah.
So these are little stories that I suppose it's nice to think about and how.
Yeah. And of course, you're in your young days going to school. You had a local school around here.
Yes. Well, there was 2 schools actually. Well, 3 schools actually in the parish. One at Asgard and one at Tarfrask, near where I spoke about the McCudder's Castle, and the other one was over in a place called Dadden that would be going towards Glengarriff. The Dadden school is closed, of course, for a good many years now, but both Tarfrask and Asgard are still open. Mm-hmm. I think there's about 30 children attending Tarfrask, and I think 12 or 14 in Asgard. But I think things are looking up. There's a lot of children born with the last few years in the parish, so at least they'll keep the school doors open, and hopefully they will.
Yeah, the old country schools were always quite. Do you remember going to school? And was it tough in your days, or did you enjoy school?
Oh, I did indeed. It wasn't tough at all. It was. I suppose we all got a few slaps now and then, but otherwise it was not tough. There was a lot of Irish taught in the schools that time, and not as much now, I think. And the sad thing about it is when people leave the school, you see, they forget the Irish language, and it's all down to practice. And the funny thing about it is that if you speak Irish to anybody today, having left school 40 or 50 years ago, they can readily understand what you're talking about, but they can't converse, again, out of practice.
And the Irish language, of course, is, if it's spoken the way you've been speaking it sounds wonderful. It's a lovely language.
Well, it is, of course. It is a pity to lose our own native tongue. It should never happen. But I think people are being realising it again, because if we go into a store or into a post office, in the summertime you'll hear the Dutch speaking their own language and the Germans speaking their own language, and the Irish are speaking the English language. And some of these remark that why don't we speak our own language?
Of course, a lot of the townslands and the signposts are in Irish, and understanding the language is a key to what's in the place.
Of course it is. And going back to last year, there was a distant relation of mine came from the United States, and he was teaching that time in Boston College, and he is teaching Irish. And he is 4 generations down from his great-grandfather was a brother to my father. So he's teaching Irish. And I met another lady who comes from Newport, Rhode Island, and she's a fluent Irish speaker. She came to Donegal on many occasions to learn the language. So the Americans are telling us how to speak our own language, and I hope we do speak our own language.
Now, at the beginning you were telling me about a story called The Red Door, Sean, and I want to hear that.
Well, it seems the story of the Red Door, it comes from a townland named Count Shanavo. And as you go up the hilly pass road from Asgard leading into County Kerry, you turn right, and that brings you into the townland of Count Shanavo. There's a story told during the famine times. There was roadworks going on in this vicinity. There were roadworks that were, as you could say, work that was done and money given by famine relief schemes. And in this particular place, it's a fairly high mountain, and up on the mountain there's, as the name suggests, a place called the Red Door. It's actually a rock, and it's colour red. And it seems it is colour red because, I suppose, segments of old mining of copper, and the segment, I suppose, with the mixture of plenty of rain and down through the ears, and turned it to red. It seems also that you find this in many places in the Beara Peninsula, this type of red in the rocks. And the mountain itself, the section of the mountain is called Cola. Cola, it seems, is an Irish word for I suppose, door, if you like, but there's probably some other name for it as well. It is a shutter, I think it's called. And one day, when the workers were exhausted from work and hungry and thirsty, they are discussing, well, there's no money this week. Some weeks they got no pay for their work, and they were, I suppose you could say, delirious from hunger and nothing to look forward to buy food for tomorrow. And one of them looked up at the mountain, and I suppose there was a tradition that the fairies were living in the mountain. And he said, I suppose he asked the woman that he thought was in the inside behind the red door, he said in the Irish language, Avan Usil o Cola Taranus agus Tur Adinair doing. He spoke to her and he asked her to come out and give them their dinner. And of course he probably didn't expect her to come out, but at least he made the request. And after a short while, the big door in the rock opened, and out comes this red-haired lady, and as she was called at the time, the Banroo. And of course they were astonished to see this woman appearing in the mountain with a basket of food. And of course they had, I suppose, all that we would ask for a good dinner, spuds and plenty of vegetables, cabbage and so on, plenty of buttermilk and fresh milk. And she brought it down and she laid a white cloth down on the place where they were working, which was the bit of land that they were tilling for the landlord. And she laid it out and put all the food on the cloth, and she invited them all to sit around to partake of the meal, of course. But the man who requested her to bring down the dinner in the first place, he refused to take any food. It seems that he, I suppose you could say, he got such a fright that if she come in the first place, that he was so excited about it, and he was in awe, I suppose. And he thought, you see, that she was a fairy, but probably she was. And you see, at the time, I suppose, advice from parents was, don't have anything to do with the fairies. And he remembered that, and he refused to take the meal. And she got very cross and she got very angry with him.
Yeah.
And she took up the meat from the dinner he had before him, and she threw it at him. She was so mad. The others, of course, had eaten there in the meantime. And when she threw the meat at him, she went away, she ran right through them in, and she wasn't heard of since. So that is the story of the Red Door and the Banroo.
And where did you get that story? Where did it come from?
Well, it is a long tradition in Adrigole. I think we had it going to school, but what you let them go to school, sometimes you forget about it. But having spoken to various people, they all had little bits and pieces, and we were able to put it together. But only just last night I was talking to Margaret Sullivan.
Mm-hmm.
Margaret is a native of County War, but is married in another part of the parish. And her father was a fluent Irish speaker, and he lived within yards of the Red Door. And he had the story, and I'm afraid he had lots of more very good stories, but sad to say, they're probably lost now. But at least this one survived, and I hope it will remain in the minds of the people for a good while yet.
It is sad, really, isn't it, that a lot of her folklore, or a lot of her stories have gone with people who just took them with them. You know, they weren't recorded. And
yes, but also we say that the young people are not interested in these things. As when you get older, you realise what you're after missing and what you're after forgetting. But on the other hand, people used to tell me that if neighbours came in to visit at night, if they were talking about stories such as this, they tell the children, go away to bed, what do you want here for? And they probably meant all right in one way, but a lot of the stories were fairy tales. And some of them, I suppose, when they'd hear some of these stories, they were afraid to go to bed. They were frightened out of their wits to hear about the fairies. And also, by doing that, you see, by sending their children to bed while this discussion was going on, some used to say if they had a two-story house, they'd have their heads through the banisters of the stairs listening, and when they'd be start to laugh or something funny would be heard, they'd be shouted at to get into bed and not mind what we were talking about. So that was unfortunate. They didn't mean it that way, but that's the way some of the stories were lost.
Yeah. And of course, not far from here we have a house which doesn't even have electricity in it. Electricity only came down here a short time ago, didn't it?
In the 1950s, the electricity came to this part of the country.
Yeah.
There's very few houses without it, though. But
yeah, you get the odd one.
There's the odd one who remains to live in the past, and I suppose they're happy in their own way. But that's how it goes.
Are you happy living down here yourself?
Oh yes, indeed, very happy. I'm, I suppose, a postman here in this parish for 42 years, and still going strong.
So no wonder you've heard all these wonderful stories.
That's right. That's right. Yes. The only thing 20 years ago you could stop and talk and sit up on the fence and get a story from somebody, but today you haven't the time to do it. You have so much to do, and of course they have their own work to do as well, and that's another tragic thing because we're missing out on some very valuable stories. Of course, another thing in the parish we see were pishogues.
Yeah.
Pishogues were superstitions. I remember when I was a child, we were going visiting my grandfather and my mother's father. We were talking outside of the house, and I saw him throwing off his hat. And I was astounded. I didn't know what was he doing. I thought he was getting queer. So when I was coming home walking, of course, with my mother, I said, "Why did he do that?" And she said, "What did he do? I never noticed it." So my father said, "Oh, he said, was there a whirlwind?" I said, "There was." "Oh," he said, "he threw his hat after the whirlwind to take away the bad luck from the ear. It was known as the shigrihe. And if a shigrihe came around the house, it was bringing bad luck, but by throwing something, a hat or a handkerchief or a shoe for that matter, after the wind, you were banishing the bad luck from the house." I thought it was strange, but I had since that it was very common to do that.
Was it? Indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was another story of a neighbour of mine went to visit neighbours one night, and when he arrived at the house, they were after killing a pig. And killing a pig at that time was a great ordeal and a great evening's work. And neighbours were in, and they were all passing remarks: was he fat or was he thin, or what to do by him, and all this. Everything was discussed about the pig. And anybody that called to the house got a bit of the pig going home. And this man, he was a great man to tell a story. And he got a bit of the pig, of course, and he was delighted because he was a man who had about 10 children, and he had more going home than he thought he'd have going home. And when he got down to the main road from the house, a hare appeared before him on the road. And a hare was supposed to be very unlucky to appear before you at night.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, the hair stood in my head. I got such a fright knowing about the pishogues. And he said, I was keeping the meat close to my breast, he said, so that I wouldn't lose it or that somebody wouldn't take it from me. And I went further on, and there was a stream crossing the road, he said. And the hare isn't supposed to, the spirits are not supposed to cross water. So the hare disappeared. But before he came to the next stream, the hare was before him again.
Yeah.
And he got very lonesome. And he went home and he told his wife the story. And she said, what have you in the paper bag? Oh, he said, I have a piece of the pig that was killed in the house where I was this evening. And she said, did you put any grain of salt in it? God, he said, I don't think so. He said, I didn't put any grain of salt in it anyway. And of course what she meant was, if we had put a grain of salt in the meat before he left the house, there'd be no spirits come before because they couldn't touch salted meat.
I see. Yes. That's a great story.